right, so my name is Josephine Lang and I work at University of Melbourne. I have a number of titles, but the one I'll share with you today is the one that's most relevant to this one, which is the Academic Director of Microcredentials. And we have just been restructured and we are now in the Office of the Provost to acknowledge the university-wide work that we do. My office, my department, I don't know what we call it, entity is called MPE, which is the Melbourne Professional Education, and we take that continuing professional education is our key remit, and that's why it's now become part of the Office of the Provost across all our 9 faculties. I have been asked to set the scene about Australian Microcredential Network. So you're going to get the world according to me, and we've got Gabrielle in the room, we've got Wendy in the room, and a few others who are also in the AMCN. So if the disclaimer is, if you don't agree, just pipe in, okay? Or if you'd like to add. Okay, so what I'm going to go through is basically 3 dot points. The first one is what's the backstory, and you'll get a little snapshot of that. And then I thought I'd share, and this will build on the Mentimeter experience that we've got, a bit about my microcredential story, so you've got a sense of what's been influencing me. And then recently I've been at the Convergence Conference in New Orleans, and I will give you a snapshot of what that was and what that's all about, but we will work on that. Okay, so is Kevin online today?
Kevin was registered to be online, so hopefully he's there.
Shout out to Kevin if you're there, and I hope you don't mind me stealing your photo. It will all be explained in the fullness of time shortly. Okay, so in terms of the Australian Microcredential Network, I'm going to explore it with 3 themes, and the themes are the green blocks that are sitting there. So the first one is about building on an idea. So how did we get here? Why have we developed this network? And the first thing was that in probably, I think it was about September in 2022, FutureLearn had run a FutureLearn Partnerships Conference with higher education providers and others that have been working in developing MOOCs, but also alternative credentials using the FutureLearn platform. And we were part of that. And when I'm sitting in one of the sessions, there was a presentation by Kevin, and what he shared with us is the next dot point, which is the Queensland Cross-Sector Microcredential Working Party. And I listened to what he had set up, and it was really quite interesting all the way that he was bringing the different sectors across Queensland to work together on multiple projects, and he explained a couple of those. And I'm sitting in that room, and I know Gabrielle was there. Wendy was in the audience online as well. And I just went, well, we've got a community of practice. We've got, you know, a number of universities. So that was percolating in my mind while I was listening to this. I reached out to Kevin by email, and I just said, oh, great presentation. Really love what you're doing. I wish we had one of these. And then he comes back with this warm invitation saying, well, why don't you become an honorary Queensland member of their working group? And then quickly we had Gabrielle on there, and also Wendy, who wasn't a Queenslander at that time. And we have become honorary members of that working party. And it's been great to just to hear how other sectors, you know, think and frame through ideas about alternative credentials and micro-credentials in particular, which of course is my bag of tricks. So that 3rd dot point really is about, well, you know, what is it like for Victoria? What was the question mark? And by the end of 2022, in December, we 3 got together and said, let's start something and see what happens. So we had we went around using our networks, inviting the higher ed sector. We were a bit introverted because we were working in that space, but we have organised a Victorian community of practice in higher education at this stage, and we have been going now for over 2 years, and we are still strong, and everyone really appreciates that. We generally meet once a month for 45 minutes, and that is nice and tight because otherwise we'd never get there. So, so that's been useful to start that up. So that was the idea, building on the idea, learning from others and what they were doing, and then thinking about FOMO and how we can use that to build on things. This next part of the story is about strength in a collective. And what happened last year and early this year was that we had this Australian Universities Accord. And we had, because I had been working with Liz Johnson, we were connected. This was how I got to meet and work with Sally Kift. She's wonderful and amazing person, and very inspiring and a great mentor as well. And of course, Jason Lodge, he's everywhere at the moment, and he's just wonderful with the power of work that he does, and he's very inspirational, not only in microcredits, but also particularly in assessment and AI. So having his perspective has been really great. So those three really got together and thought about how we could respond to the questions to create the final report, which you see there, and there's a link there if you're not from the university sector and you want to have a look at what's being proposed. But what was really interesting about this was that in I think we had about 4 or 5 pages, and then added another page of endorsements from little groups, or some not so little because they were little by our standards, but then for our group. But there was also, national entities within the universities as well. And so what we had proposed for our response was to establish some kind of learning and teaching council, so that there's scholarship and support for sharing best practice across the university sector. And that was picked up as one of the series of recommendations. Hopefully this will emerge, but there's politics and then there's elections, so who knows when we're going to see the response of this. But if you're interested in that, go to chapter 6 and recommendation 30. The other thing that we didn't really talk about, because we were talking more generally about how to improve the quality of learning and teaching within the sector and how to integrate that idea of work integrated learning, things that we always talk about in the microcredential community. But one of the things that has also come out in chapter 2 of that report is the focus on skills and microcredentials in higher education. So even if you don't work in higher education, still suggest that you have a look at that, because it was talking about how do we bridge the learning journey and the lifelong learning journey, between voc ed, secondary schools and higher ed. So it is broader than just higher ed. So I think it would probably speak to a lot of people that are sitting in the room or online. So what that taught for me was the idea that there is a strength in combining and bringing groups together. And so that idea of the collective voice and the strength in that was a good learning from that activity. So the third pillar of this story is about, well, how do we get those, what seemingly can operate as fragmented voices, how do we bring them into a national voice? And that's how the Australian Microcredential Network really got formed. Out of that experience and a few other things, we established a planning group, and there's about a dozen of us at the moment that are trying to come together and think, what is the purpose of this group? We're playing around with this to have that discussion so that we can inform our terms of reference, which will be of interest to everyone sitting here, and how we might work. The planning group is having a number of conversations about sharing. What do we want to share? And I think I am really thinking about the framework of 3 pillars of knowing, acting and being. And knowing, of course, is the knowledge, and of course universities and any providers, education providers, are about the knowing and the knowledge generation. Acting is, well, what do we do? What is the lived experience of the work that we do? And I think that is an important pillar that we want to try and capture in the terms of reference. And the last one sometimes could be missed, but it's the idea of being. And that's really about our identity. And I think in the Mentimeter, we were all sharing some of our own identity and the ways of working, and that we were trying to crosswalk. How do we actually bridge and work together? And so that's a real important pillar that I think we shouldn't lose as well. Other drivers are the lifelong learning and the idea of formal, informal. There's lots of way to learn, and how do we acknowledge and recognise that? And a lot of you mentioned that in the Mentimeter. And part of that is that microcredentials can enable that as a mechanism. So that's kind of our focus, and our friend Margot will get us to expand and spread the way we think about that as well. Another driving force here is the idea of agency, student agency, but also higher ed providers and ed techs and the way they work with each other. So that idea of empowering people to be in control of what they're doing and what they're developing is really important. So I think an underpinning principle is that idea of equity, and how do we empower that within the systems that we build. So I think those probably give you some insights of what are the drivers for that are underpinning our network. And if you like what you hear, hopefully you'll come in and join. And if you are wanting to join us, we have, thanks to Wendy, established a LinkedIn group page. And when you get these slides circulated, that links you so that you can join in. We've got already 159 members, which I think is amazing considering we haven't got any marketing or anything like that. And we've only been in establishment since about end of August of this year. So
very new.
Very, very new. Okay, so what we will move on to now is the second dot point in my overview, which is giving you a little bit more about my microcredential story, and it will hopefully give you some sense of what is influencing me. When I was working, I joined University of Melbourne in April 2019. Before then, I had spent 7 years at Deakin University, and that's how we know each other. Or did we go back as RMIT as well?
We could have gone.
So it was, these two are kind of my seminal pieces of work over the last X amount of years, and have influenced me. When I was working at Deakin, I was in the School of Education. I'm a teacher by training, and I was the Associate Dean Teaching and Learning, and looking over 11 initial teacher education courses, and we were going through accreditation at the time, and there's a whole lot of work that goes in there. Beverly Oliver was our DVCE, and she was driving the idea about employability, and then moved on to microcredentials as a mechanism to be able to support that. One of the things that drew to me in when she was setting up seminars, and I'd be going and finding out what this is, and is it just a, you know, one of those bells and whistles thing that will fade, that will go away. And what I realised there was a lot of promise. There was perils, but there was a lot of promise about what microcredentials could offer. And for me as a teacher and an educator, what sang to me was that it was an opportunity for a pedagogical innovation. And so that's how I had played with it and really thought about the work that I was involved with, initial teacher education. So Deakin, we established a teamwork hallmark, which was one of the graduate attributes that we espoused, that we have evidence of that across the course. And we created metadata and a project assessment by portfolio. And if you're interested in that, there's a link to the metadata and you can have a look at that. I then moved on to Melbourne Uni, and what we looked at there was the idea of moving from pre-professional education or preparation for professions to a remit where we're looking at continuing and professional education. And so now what we're doing is looking at post-professional. So even though I'm looking at two different contexts, we can still use microcreds for that. And that's what's been influencing the way we're looking at that. If you're interested in having a look at what kind of metadata we have now, you can link to this when you have a go at that. The second part of my microcredential story is the idea of partnerships and influence. And so here are 3 examples of what we were doing. So we've got the big purple thing on this side of the slide is the idea, and the work that I've been working on is the link and engagement with industry. And there are different ways that we are looking at that. Someone mentioned co-design on the Mentimeter responses. So we look at co-design, but the thing that's really driving me at the moment is the idea of linking to capability frameworks or skills frameworks from industry, and how do we represent that in the badge as part of the metadata. So you can have a look at that. But the way to do that is to actually work with edtechs. And at the worry of embarrassing some of our colleagues here, Margot and Dan are representing work with edX, obviously. And that's what I have been doing for the last, I don't know, 3, maybe 4 years, working with them in partnership to actually influence, as well as use their technology, but also influence their own roadmaps on what we're expecting and how we might drive those things together, and learning together about how to build a better product that we can use with our learning. So it's a nice way to match those kind of things. The thing in the middle is about Job Skills Australia, which I've been involved with the last probably about 2 years in conversation. And what we're doing there is, again, partnering them to do some pilot projects on how we can use the skills classification framework, soon to be a taxonomy. Well, I don't think too soon, but in reality, it will be a 5-year project, I'm sure. So until then, we are using the classification framework. Again, that idea of using industry to support what we might do in our curriculum design and how we might represent that in the metadata. So pilot projects there, but also a lot of influence from the work that we've been doing already, and it was acknowledged that we are leaders in this, particularly from a higher ed perspective. And so it's important for us to be acknowledged by that and also contribute to policy and practice. So there's stuff there for you to have a look at. The last 2 slides will be, how we're going for time?
About another 5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. I think this is the first time I'm actually in time. So the last part part of the ask was to talk about giving you some sharing of international trends that have been happening. I've been going to Convergence Conference since the start, which sounds like a long time. It only started last year. So we've had 2 conferences, annual conferences. These Convergence Conference are really interesting because I don't think there's anything else in the US that brings these 2 audiences together. So UPCEA is an online and professional education association based in Washington, DC. And AACRAO is the University Registrars Collection, and they've got a long name. It's there, you can work that out. Again, I've hyperlinked that if you want to have a look at their remit and visions, and I've just did a quick grab of that here. This was a very unusual coupling for me because registrars, yes, I'm in the university, and yes, I'm even, I work with the registrars, but I never realized that how powerful they are in terms of an ally for curriculum innovation like microcreds. So don't underestimate who could be your partner and ally. So have a look at that. I have put a couple of examples of some of the resources that both organisations have, which might be of interest to you. So again, you can hyperlink out there and also to their resources. And there's a lot of free stuff that is very, very interesting. But this is the slide that really summarises for me, from my perspective in engaging with both of these conferences across 2 years. Because Wendy asked, well, what have you noticed? What are the themes that are jumping out of you? And so what I've done is just tried to create what I thought the first conference was like and what were the themes in the second one. So in 2023, there was a lot of talk about definitions of microcredentials, and I thought, I'm going to die if they talk about this any longer. And so I just tried, after a while, I just skipped those sessions because I looked for some other ones. There was a lot of small-scale projects which were experimenting with how do we represent skills in the higher education institution. So that was really interesting because we were playing with that as well. A lot of buzzwords. There were CLRs, wallets, LERs, PERs, if we talk about edX. There were so many different records and it was swimming. My head was swimming. I was trying to work out what the difference were and so forth. So there were a lot of buzzwords. And the other thing that I think I would identify is that it really showed that the higher education sector was grappling with what to do with these microcreds. They knew it was innovative, but is it here to stay? Should we hedge our bets? So there was a lot of that kind of angst in there. Come 2024 in New Orleans, it was really interesting to see how it ramped up right at the start. And there was a much stronger and sharper focus on microcreds. And instead of talking about alternative credentials, they said, we're not going to call them alternative, we're just going to call them by what they are, which is microcreds. And I think that they just got over the definitional stuff, which was, thank God, because there's so much more that we have to explore. And then the other themes were really about digging deeper. Last year, it was all about little experiments and here and there and pockets. Here, it was really about going deeper, lots of case studies, lots of multi-institutional projects, and going from small to large scale, and how do you scale up innovation. The search for quality started to creep in, which is something that I'm really keen in, particularly about how you engage and enable assessment as a quality indicator in microcreds. And the other thing that we realised was, of course, because there's registrars in the room, we had a focus on governance, because that's what they do. And of course, they keep us honest on those things. So that was really important as well. There's a lot more examples of how do you get that quality compliance and regulation things happening. So there was definitely that case studies of policy and practice. The other digging deeper theme was the idea of an increased focus on partnerships. So that was really interesting. And there was a lot more ed techs, not by themselves in representation, but in partnership with institutions and what they might be able to bring and what were they sharing and what were they learning. And not only ed techs, there was partnerships with data entities like CAST, but also labour force statistics and government agencies and so forth. So really bringing that idea of industry and academia together, which was really important, and the focus on microcredentials as supporting upskilling, but also representing that skills and employers and starting to think about how does this work for employers. So they were the kind of takeaways for me from that conference. And that, I think, does me. I think that's it.
Before you leave, any quick questions for Josephine?
Okay, thank you for that question. So the question for those that were online was about the University of Melbourne having a presence in microcredentials, which was a bit unexpected. And then when she dug around and had a look, she realised that there were quite a few microcredentials in that portfolio. And then what is the future for Melbourne University? So at the moment, what we're finding is that, yes, we do have a portfolio. We have over 100 microcreds that we have developed, but not all of them are as successful. So some are being rested at the moment. And what we're finding is that the ones that have been successful are the ones that we've involved industry partners and really thought about co-design, and they end up being our B2B offerings. And so what we're actually doing at the moment, because we have had a restructure, we're pausing B2C microcreds and focusing on our B2B products at this stage. So that will probably go for another at least 12 months. And we are creating a project with the Office of the Provost and a project team to have a look at how can we better enable the B2C microcreds. What is it? You know, what's the business model? What's the curriculum model? How do we get that working? So we've just, well, the kickoff is tomorrow to establish that, and we've just scoped what the project would look like. So I think at the moment we're focusing basically our B2B development, but B2C, we're working out where do we go next. So since we have been for 5 years, I think it's a real opportune time to have a pause and reflect and work out, you know, what our next steps are. So that's kind of where we're going at University of Melbourne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think it is interesting, especially in higher ed, seeing lots of universities having done initial initiatives now taking a pause for a variety of reasons, and maybe taking a step back and saying, where do these things actually fit? What are we doing with them? You know, and I think what I'm seeing as well is that when they started, they were just like lots of little short courses, whereas now people are saying, hang on, where do they actually fit into the curriculum? What's the role higher ed should play? So we'll watch with interest what Melbourne Uni does.